Hey, so what I was hearing from you guys before was that there is minimal or limited support in AMP for forms. Could you please expand more upon that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of a careful person, so I didn't know what what forms would be like used for in an AMP context. So I first thought like, let's just make them illegal, so I don't have to think about it. Um, that is the actual answer. I mean, I think they're useful for stuff like newsletter registrations in this context. Other stuff like it. For now, basically the workaround is to use an iframe. I think we will eventually whitelist them. Yeah, it's just that since there's an entire security model behind it, it's really hard to always think of things through. So yeah, I was just lazy.
Right. But for those of us in the financial industry, I mean, everything is essentially a form, but we do want high performance. Is there no middle ground?
Well, yeah. So we really focused on this like content consumption use case. So I think everything about AMP applies to performance in general. But I think if you want to get this effect that you can ensure certain variance, you need to make compromises. So I think there could be a version of that uses the same approach as AMP that applies to other use cases, but it just doesn't apply to all use cases. It might be extended to more. Like I could see it working in e-commerce, but like that's definitely not what we focus on right now.
So I think it could happen. I think right now we're focusing more on lower hanging fruit use cases.
Cool.
Hello, hello. Hi. So exactly, it's a very similar question. Both scroll boxes and forms are obviously something that, as web developers, we really find valuable. And the question is, does AMP work in the context of an iframe? You think of Gmail, and you have an iframe for the content, but you have interactive aspects of the for filtering and scroll boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually designed AMP to be integratable into like more complex web apps. So like actually when you look at the Google search demo, they are embedded into these into search essentially. And you could imagine the same thing for Gmail. I actually wrote a post last week about how you could use a service worker to kind of upgrade the experience. So a user would first go to an AMP file and just get the AMP file. That's fast. But then you would install a service worker, and the next time you come, you intercept that, you load your app shell, and then load the AMP file into that app shell. So I think there can be this perfect middle ground where a user always gets a good experience, but they also get the like super advanced experience when they come for the second time.
Thank you.
I'm starting to work with polymers, so one of the questions was, is there going to be a point in which both polymer and AMP can be integrated in the same page or in the same application?
I think not at first, right? I don't think there are any plans for that right now. It's definitely something to think about.
So the answer I would like to give is, first of all, the awesome thing about web components is that they're compatible by default. And the second thing is basically like, Polymer is obviously technology to build applications, while AMP cannot be used to build applications. So like zero overlap. And so what I would really like to see is something like paper or like Polymer-AMP element that puts an AMP element into a Polymer application. Like that's the type of integration you would usually see. So they're entirely complementary technologies because they focus on like essentially disjunct use cases.
One quick question, one quick thing before we go to the next question. If you are not in this room but have a question, right, come in and just come into the line to ask a question.
Great talk today. I really liked the first talk I liked the most because that gave me the most about what I can do. But some of the other things that you mentioned in AMP, I wasn't very excited about, especially its own custom tags, and it doesn't allow you to write your own, execute your own JavaScript and CSS3 properties. So I just want to understand, like, can you address the business side of the issue? Because from what I've heard, and I've heard this on the internet, that Google want to control, because if your data is coming from their CDN, they're caching everything, right? And right now, the biggest offender in web performance is JavaScript, and mainly the JavaScript coming from ad publishers and ad analytics. And a lot of ad blockers, the way they work is they block those so that there are no ads shown, the websites work, the performance improves, right? But right now with AMP, like if you block that HTTP request, you essentially block the whole, like you can't see the web page. So can you address like why did you create this and what is the business reason for this? Because right now I'm not sold, if there were other talks talking about more about general web performance that we can improve our websites, I would be more excited to learn some of those things.
So AMP doesn't change ad blocking at all. It still works the same way, right? The ads are served from the same place. The analytics are served from the same place. It doesn't impact that at all. One thing it does do is make the user experience better. Maybe there'll be less of a need for it. That definitely isn't a primary concern for AMP, right? The primary concern, the primary use case for AMP is, if someone's coming to a link from, Twitter's app or Google Search or Google News, we want it to be as fast as possible because we know that when things are faster, people read more of them, and we want people to read as much content as they want to be able to and not be limited by artificial constraints in technology as a result of speed, right? So I think there's ways to AMP tries to kind of use techniques to make it really easy to make reliably fast web pages so that you can embed them in contents like or in areas like that, and also just have a better user experience. It doesn't have anything to do with ads or analytics.
I also want to add and stress that we all would love, and I think we all aim for the web as at large to be faster. So I think if you have a really fast website, keep doing that, right? There's no reason for you to be jumping on AMP if your site is already really, really fast. And also, you shouldn't be penalized for that. The reason why, for instance, right now, being in our demo search carousel requires AMP is because the validation of an AMP document, because of its constraints, are much simpler on our side. That doesn't mean that it has to be forever, right? Ideally, we would keep all of those best practices, find out what they are, and then make the validation independent of it so that other sites could be in there. But that's a long-term goal, right? I think all of us, we would like to be there. But in the short term, we like to have a test bed where we can iterate and try out things quickly.
I think the real answer is, you all saw Paul's slide with the manager and the developer. AMP is much more about solving that slide than it is about anything else, right? Because I talked about best practice today, but none of this is new, right? It could have been done before, it just wasn't done, right? And it's about solving that problem because you can keep on giving talks, but if the business case isn't there, and if the wider ecosystem doesn't change, it doesn't help. And I think we've all looked at this for a while, and it was just time to actually do something.
Well, I mean, things have been getting better. Like the mobile traffic is increasing, right?
It actually haven't gotten better.
Well, in the web, the performance has improved, but in the mobile is where the new next big market is, right? So that's why there's this push. And I mean, I appreciate some of the motive behind the user experience and improving everything, but just the approach is, I personally feel I can write better JavaScript than what it's giving me. You know what I mean? Like I don't need to use something, because I mean the frameworks are one of the culprits, but there are other things we could I guess do as developers. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll add and respond a little bit there, which is that it's very difficult to pull off the kind of performance that that I was talking about, right? Like getting a page to render its critical content within a second is incredibly tricky to pull off. And there's not just you as a developer need to know a lot of information to be able to do that, but you also don't need you can't accommodate that goal while still satisfying management when they're asking you to add this and add that. And it's also a very hard thing to maintain, right? To make sure that as you're developing, you're not regressing, and that's why I think the approach with AMP says we're going to lay down some ground rules. We can validate these, and basically validate that this is in fact going to be fast. Now, that isn't to say that the same kind of performance can't be had outside of those constraints. I think that it can be. There's folks like yourself can absolutely write JavaScript that can still satisfy all those exact performance goals. But in general, it doesn't happen very often. And it's very, it's infrequent. And so I think by and large, this approach of basically identifying a subset that we can validate where it's going to be good is both a nice way to cut off what satisfies the performance goals, but also is a nice way to basically lay down some ground rules for developers and teams and managers for what is actually gonna get whitelisted.
Yeah, it's a good approach. I mean, that's why Twitter Bootstrap was built. That's why React was built. Others have gone even further than Google's gone with Facebook trying to cache up your stuff and own it all, which is just the way they do everything. Great developers, and they're great developers. He's an Oracle developer, so he can make shit really fast because they do that. But the question is your approach also best for the ecosystem around it? Because some of the problems that, it's always a war changing between new frameworks that do different things that people are saying, no, I don't want that to happen in an enterprise environment. Most of the people you're going to deal with, they're going to use something simply. If your tool is simple and it fits a use case, great. If it uses things open in the web, great. The whole idea of caching stuff initially, some people have security questions on and issues, but hey, it's an approach. The question I want to ask is, what haven't you fixed that's on your roadmap that you really want to attack next? You may have gone over it earlier, but I want to really look at that because we don't have a tool where someone could go on any site and say, there's Google Web Builder, you can test it, just knock out all the problems here and make it run fast. That's the part with a great framework. If you can just plug and play for 99% of people build on the web, whether it's hosted or otherwise, then you can actually solve the big, great problem you're attacking, which I think is an honorable goal. If you productize that so somebody can just use something to test that, boom, and get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, and validate the new features that drop in, you can reach that.
So we do have page speed insights that kind of does that. I think page speed insights could be improved a bit to kind of capture the advanced techniques that AMP uses.
Yeah, that would be great. Drop it in even in just Chrome Inspector and say, AMP eyes, these features don't fit, they're causing the problem, knock them out this way and move on. That's how you really do it, because that's where most of the developers you can sway are working in.
Yeah. I actually really like what your point. I totally agree with you that
because this is a noble effort. You're really trying to move the world.
Certainly. And we want, it's absolutely imperative that a developer that cares, that is motivated to work on performance, has enough information and enough direction to be this, and this, address those, you're good. And that's the answer that you want. I think PageSpeed Insights gets you part of that way there. Working with the Chrome DevTools, profiling tools also help. But I think there's more work that we can do to really clarify and bring it to a level that everyone could take action on immediately.
One of the simple things. You could just let everybody know, percentage-wise, for people who use Chrome DevTools, what are the biggest problems people see with this type of code?
Right.
It's an easy thing to do. Everybody loads. What's the average load for this type of line of code or this type of command in JavaScript?
Yep.
CSS.
Yeah. I like that. We're working. Paul and I work a lot on the DevTools. We're drafting a number of features that are along these lines. You're gonna like it. It's good.
And reality, right? I mean, if we on that final point, if we have a full-blown validator that can validate not just page load speed, right, but runtime speed, how much the page drains your battery, etc. If we exactly. What error causes that, right? If we had all of that in place, we might not need a custom solution like AMP to drive all of that, right? So AMP was born out of a reality that we are in right now. But it's my hope that we'll have that validator and that we can drive it for the entire web.
Hi, I'm a web developer, but I also usually think about web pages in terms of being a user. From that perspective, I totally get and am very appreciative of the idea of accelerating mobile pages. When I put back on my developer hat, a concern that I haven't delved too deeply into your documentation on AMP yet, and I've heard from other developers, is to what extent is AMP mobile only, or put another way, is it compatible with responsive web design in that you have one web page and it works everywhere? Thanks.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so that sounds like a myth then.
You know, the mobile, right? It's in the name because AMP is a good acronym. And because that's like, so no, the real answer is, so latency on the web is actually primarily driven by connection latency, and that is worse on mobile connections. And so the problem that AMP solving is significantly worse on mobile. What that leads to is that the same page works absolutely amazingly ultra fast on desktop, right? So that's great. And so we actually have responsive design built in. So one of the things that's really hard when all you have is CSS and a bit of JavaScript is making great responsive images. So that's, for example, completely built into the platform. Then obviously all the standard CSS media query stuff just works. One thing we did is we added the media attribute that you know from, for example, the source elements inside of picture. That is actually supported in every single AMP dash element. So what you can use this for example, is you can, people do sometimes use entirely different ads on desktop. So you can put two AMP dash add tags next to each other and put two media queries on them. And because AMP never loads anything that isn't actually visible, if you basically media query away the mobile ad and you put the desktop ad in the same place, it will only render one of them. So it's definitely, in reality, it's from the ground up designed for responsive design. And yeah, so it's definitely a myth, and we're totally behind that.
Thank you.
Hi, you talked a little bit about how AMP interacts with third-party ad serving, and does it interact with third-party analytics?
Yeah, so we actually have a very interesting approach, I think, to analytics. So one of the things you observe, and essentially all of the sites that we target, is that they have all of the analytics providers. And so what happens is that you start maybe with like Adobe Analytics, and then someone says like, let's use Google Analytics, and then you find, oh shit, the numbers are like a bit off. Let's just keep the old one because my boss wants the graphs just keep going up. And so 5 years later, and you have all of them, right? And so this is where we are in almost all sites. And so what we are going to do, and like this is currently in progress, but what we are going to do is we'll have a single, auditable, open source, super fast analytics library that you'll be able to configure to send its data to every backend you choose to. So you measure once, okay, the user clicked, and it's just going to go and send it to Adobe and to Google and to like Chartbeat, Parsley, whatever. Like basically, they all get fetched from the same pool, but you don't pay the price of multiple instrumentation.
Thank you very much, and I am very happy that you're supporting most of the SVG tags, including linear radial gradients and filters. Comment, I spoke to Paul before about the impact of AMP on the open web, and that might be something that would be of interest to people. Is AMP going to kill the open web?
No.
That's a loaded question.
So I think how I describe this. How do you apply an AMP file? You have an HTML file. You put it on a web server. There's no step 2, right? So that's what the web is, right? You have HTML files and web servers.
Yeah,
I think it's very.
But if people are going to go to the AMP pages because they're so fast, why are they going to go to the non-AMP pages, which are a lot slower? So it's going to have an adverse impact potentially, despite the additional functionality that they provide.
I think content wins, right? So not everything can be done well in AMP. So if you want to have like a amazing full page interactive, that's just something that's just entirely impossible in AMP. and that's fine, right? So I think what if this is successful, which we don't know, and it will change user expectations, and that will hopefully push everything on the web to a better state. So and I think, then everyone's happy. So I think that's
So I thought about this a couple days ago, where we talked about more third-party integrations, like more ad libraries, more analytics, etc. And it came to me that this could seriously improve not just AMP, right? For instance, if you're an analytics company and you want to integrate with AMP, you have to follow certain guidelines to integrate with it. Like there are certain things that you just cannot do. And my hope is that ultimately that will drive them to just, because it's really a hassle to maintain multiple libraries of the same kind, that it drives them to implement great improvements to the third-party solutions in the first place, that they will then roll out to the broader web, right? So it doesn't just improve AMP, but it improves everything else. That's at least my hope, and that's what I like to get out of it, really.
And the other thing is, you don't have to have a separate AMP website, right? You can just have one website that is AMP, that is your canonical website. There's no m.issue issue or anything like that. I think it's important to note, like, at first, AMP, the problem AMP is trying to solve first, and right now, is there's all these publishing companies who have websites with all their stuff on it, and it's mostly static content, except for, a couple dialogues or data visualizations. And the content, and all these websites know that they have performance issues. And so, like, many of the major top publishers have built, like, entire teams of, like, 3 to 5 engineers who just focus on performance. And that's great if you're one of those 5. But if you're not, it's kind of hard. And so this is a way to make it really easy to have that kind of extreme level of your own dedicated performance team for publishers that didn't previously exist. And someday it could, it evolve into something that handles retail content or finance content in a much more reasonable way. But I don't think it should until it's ready to do so at a feature parity. I don't think it makes sense to have like a watered down version just for phones. That's not the right way to go about it.
Bottom line, we want everyone to win, right? We want to have the open web win. We want users to win. We want publishers to win. It should be a win-win-win situation.
Hey, yeah, I have a question. So I'm kind of a lazy developer, a web developer. So of course I use a framework for working with building the application that I'm working on, and it's a single-page application. So when my users are already in the application, there's a way for them to publish some content. And if someone navigates to that, it just does an XHR request and fetches it if they're already in the application. But if someone was coming from their mobile device and there was a link shared for, say, one of the articles that someone published, it'd be great to have, maybe with AMP or with something else, to have that one page load very quickly, and for it to be kind of handled with some kind of tooling so that I could have like an AMP view for those content types already just served from my database, but maybe populated out into AMP views. And also my company does regular editorial and just has editors working on WordPress for the other stuff, basically. And they have a lot of things published there. It'd be great to be able to generate AMP views for a lot of those things, but still have it live within our ecosystem as well. How would I go about doing that potentially?
So I talked earlier about this approach where you could use service workers for essentially this same thing. If you want to get a bit more sophisticated, you can, for example, and you want to make it work in Safari, you kind of like use app cache and stuff and set a cookie that you did that, and then kind of use the same effect. But yeah, basically you would do first view AMP, second view rich application that loads the AMP file. So that's, I think, the pattern. I think I'm not aware that this has actually been done, but I think I'm hoping for it to happen. And I think that's kind of the future for like publishing websites that use AMP for like their delivery format and then build richer experience based on that. Regarding WordPress, so WordPress is one of our key partners. They actually launched on the same day that AMP launched a plugin in like super alpha mode. So, but I think Paul has been trying it out. It kind of works. I think they're going to make it better. Yeah, it's definitely obviously like if you're in publishing, then CMS systems are kind of important. So yeah, hopefully we'll get good support across
I'll
the
definitely
board.
tell the WordPress team about that. My other app is mostly driven with Angular. Is there any sort of easy route to take some of the stuff that's generated in there and bootstrap on top of an AMP page so that it starts to work once it's loaded? Probably not, right?
Right. Yeah, there isn't. You
be
can go
magic.
make one, and then everyone else can use it.
I'll think about it.
With actually, I'm going to ask you, Malte. So with the service worker approach, I guess it's a little interesting because script on the page is disallowed, but loading a service worker through the manifest is totally fine in AMP.
So we haven't implemented this, but I think it's only going to be like 10 lines. So what we'll basically have is we'll have a tag on AMP pages for registering service workers. And then the service worker itself can basically do whatever it wants. Because it runs on your page, it's your page, you can do whatever you want. So that's kind of the answer.
So like the service worker could like set up push notifications and then that is the entry point back into the Angular like full app experience or something like that.
I'm just curious, if we all go home and delete all our CSS files and do inline and move to AMP, what would be the net gain, your impressions, your estimate? What would be the net gain?
Like what's the point of all this?
Yes.
It's a fair question, yeah. What do we get out of it? What's the benefit?
I mean, so statistically speaking, we launched this with 30 publishers, and we did some performance sampling on them. And so what we saw was performance gains between 15 and 85%. So I think that's pretty good. And most were more the distribution was more towards the 85%. 15% was the Guardian, and I think the second best was more to over 50% faster. So yeah, it's so that I like the web better and everyone else here likes the web better, because I was really annoyed. Maybe it was because I had only a 3G phone, but surfing isn't a great experience right now, and I think we're hoping to make that better.
And please don't delete your website. I think right now, if you want to have something to do when you get home, it would be to try AMP out, figure out what's missing, because it's not there yet. Figure out what's missing and create some feature requests and think about implementing some of that stuff. I think that's a much more immediate course of action.
Okay, quick question about font loading. So, what is actual innovation in AMP with font handling font?
So the question is there actual innovation in terms of?
What is innovation in handling new fonts?
So again, like we're just implementing best practices, right? So I talked about, like, I think very in detail that AMP achieves something that's generally very hard, which is that there's 0 HTTP requests needed to determine what fonts are on the page, so that they start downloading much earlier than you would see in a regular web page. We have an open GitHub issue to implement more sophisticated font loading. This is also not something that's crazy new. So there's actually a proposal to make this first class in CSS. So there will be something like font display optional. So if you think about fonts on a web page, they're typically in 2 categories. There's the logo font that's more like an image. So you want to maybe render it before it's there, but you definitely don't want to use Arial fallback for your logo. But there's the content font where it's possibly completely fine to not have your special font, and where you might want to implement the logic that you say, if it's cached, great. If it's not cached, go with the fallback immediately and never do anything else. So we want to enable like expressing those relationships really easily. But since we're built on web technology, it's obviously something you can do today. And I think there's some great libraries out there that like do this kind of stuff. So I'm not sure like innovation is the right dimension, but basically great baseline speed, and then eventually when we implement this issue, pretty good control over font loading.
Okay, thank you.
I'll add in that, like, just to describe kind of the normal, typical web font experience. You have a page, you have something like Typekit. Typekit distributes like the majority of web fonts that I see, at least. Page sees that there's a script file, unlike the Typekit CDN. It's like, okay, let's issue a request. It's a new domain, so we'll have to do a DNS lookup first before we establish TCP. It does all that stuff. It finally gets the JavaScript. Then at some point, the JavaScript gets a chance to run on the main thread because we have to run it. We run it, and then it's like, oh, I'm going to need that CSS file. So let's go issue a request for that. It goes and issues a request for that. That file has all of the fonts data URI'd into that one file, regardless of like if those fonts are necessary like later on, like other pages or like in the footer or something. It's all there. The file's usually really big. That whole download finishes. And then like much later, we wait for a style recalc, and then finally a layout, and then like we paint the page. And like there's, like 70 steps basically in this entire thing. And the AMP approach on fonts is, let's see if we can remove like 99% of those steps and just like simplify it down to, I think we need a font. Let's get it. Let's apply it. And it makes the gap between like, I think we need a font to having it on the page extremely, extremely fast. So it's definitely doing web fonts right is actually really hard. This is why whenever we load a page on our phone, like you see the underlines and the bullet points for like a good few seconds before you actually see the text come in. It's hard to pull off.
We also, like, AMP is very opinionated about how font loading is allowed to work. So we allow it triggering of fonts only via CSS. So you get to use font face, as you want in your custom CSS, and then we whitelist certain font providers that do CSS only inclusions, because obviously font providers are great for caching. So we basically, if a font provider supports link tag based only inclusion of fonts, they can request being whitelisted for AMP. But that's the requirement. So if a font provider is JavaScript based, which cannot be fast in any possible way, then they cannot be used with AMP.
So pretty much when it is in JavaScript, pretty much you cannot do anything better than it is now. Pretty much when a font is called from JavaScript, which calls CSS, you cannot pretty much optimize too much because you will not pre-process JavaScript. Pretty much, okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hey, you talked about the AMP-Twitter element. Can you talk a little bit about the process to create new elements like that?
Absolutely. So I mean, we actually have this documented on our GitHub. But basically, so first of all, it's not entirely necessary to make a new like dedicated embed for every type of embed. So we have the amp-iframe tag for like generic stuff, and then we kind of have a process in place for when to make new elements. In general, basically, that's like what we expect the majority of pull requests to be, because there's a lot of those. We kind of created, like, we bootstrap ourselves with the elements that like the publishers that we launched with found most important. We have a long list of bullet points of guidelines that we like to see for those embeds. So first of all, the embeds cannot run JavaScript on the other page except when it's open source and checked into the AMP repository, and it has to be audited and comply in terms of performance guidelines. If it's iframe based, we prefer direct iframe embeds, so not some crazy stuff that downloads more iframes and does recalculations. We prefer embeds that actually don't use iframes because iframes are really expensive. on mobile because they cost a lot of memory, on desktop because they run all your frickin' Chrome extensions again. So and we actually have seen this process work really well. So for example, Pinterest contributed embeds, and they actually went from an all like super generic iframe approach to doing like essentially zero iframe HTML only embeds, which are super efficient, use almost zero memory, and do exactly what they need. And so, for example, they added a new course endpoint to get the pin count. So obviously the easy way in is to do the iframe, right? But just a little bit like code review and saying like, cool, can you just make a course endpoint and get the data and just put it in the page instead of loading like a 50 megabyte iframe into the page, like did wonders. And now we have this super efficient embed. So I think that I'm hoping that that's just the process that we can like go, and then obviously that makes the entire web better because now that course endpoint is there and you can make like a great embed for everyone.
Thank you.
So I was just thinking, now that we've been working on, Gulp and Webpack and JSPM, and we can uglify and minify and zombify the 5,000 files from NPM and Bower, and we're all experts at that. It kind of seems like that AMP is sort of orthogonal to all of this. I mean, do those things fit together? It doesn't really seem like they do. Am I wrong?
I mean, AMP is built with Gulp using NPM modules.
Oh, it is? Interesting.
With Babel JavaScript.
Oh, wow. So we don't have to worry about learning new stuff.
Also, I want to add, that a lot of the things that matter in a build process, like minifying images, right, is still super, super important. It's not something that AMP by itself does. Maybe the CDN in the future, but a lot of it is still very valid.
Okay, great.
Good. Final question? All right, go for it.
Cool. So a lot of the stuff that you're doing really reinforces the values that like Grigoric proposed a few years ago, and I think the next Ilya Grigoric. I think the next sort of step is what I can think of as for CSS especially is to kind of use the specification for link in the response headers to prefetch CSS for the mobile clients especially. Do you see that to be a standard that's going to be implemented in browsers pretty soon that we can take use of to make things a little bit faster, or not, or would it really make a difference in the end?
Yeah, I think so. We have. I am mostly forgetting. The link rel preload is right now behind an experimental flag in Chrome. It's a really amazing. It's a really nice, really well designed feature and spec. So that's at least in the markup. So the HTML can basically say, I'm going to need all these files. Please go get them right now. And I also described that this is a font, and this is a script, and this is a style sheet. And so please handle these appropriately. There's certainly been discussions around providing that ability to preload at the HTTP response header level, so that the response header of the HTML could indicate what preloads should happen rather than the HTML. It'll probably happen after it lands in the link rels that happen. So it'll be it'll follow up. Yeah. So certainly plenty of discussion. It'll happen. It'll take a while. But the link rel preload is going to be the first thing. And to be honest, I can't be more excited about it. It's for web fonts, for everything. It's going to be really, really good.
I think there's always HTTP 2 as well.
Yeah. HTTP 2 accelerates a lot of the latency concerns on the requests. But yeah, being able to declaratively with server push too, right? HTTP server push on the Chrome team, we're playing around with the demo of this and identifying that with server push you can basically just say, here's the HTML. Also, here's all these other files. You're gonna need them. Blah 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 blah. You can do that right now and basically just force the assets down the pipe even before the browser even knows it's going to need them, and you can pull it off amazingly. So actually, to be honest, that's something you can do right now, and it's even better than what you're asking for. So
right. I
do
think,
that.
by the way, one important insight with push is that the problem with push is you don't know what the client has already fetched, right? So it's sometimes really hard. Like, for example, it's your main JavaScript or CSS file, they might already have it, and now you send them bytes they already have. But where push is amazing, for example, if you build, let's say in the context of AMP, you have this AMP file and you have this viewer thing that's your application around it that loads AMP files. So if your URL already indicates what the eventual AMP URL will be, because content is unlikely to be cached already because otherwise people wouldn't look at it, it's definitely a good candidate for pushing. So I think definitely push, it's not like you can't just, it's not the silver bullet, but for certain use cases, it's super powerful and definitely still very much underused.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.